I'm happy to welcome you here to this virtual lunch together with David Kessler. I'm Michael Kerman with Leading Edge Seminars, and I'm really happy to welcome you here for this next hour. If you don't know us, we're a company in Toronto who for many years hosted speakers live on topics that really relate to how you help people and how you care people. And since the pandemic has started, we've been, like everyone else, doing everything online. And these monthly virtual lunch togethers are really our ways to introduce you to and give you the opportunity to actually talk with people who've changed the world of psychotherapy and counseling. And most of our audience are psychotherapists and counselors. Everyone's invited to attend. So what we're going to do is I'm going to tell you a few things about what we have coming up at Leading Edge. Then I'll tell you how we're going to work this next hour. David will be introduced, and then we'll chat with David and then give you the opportunity to ask questions a little bit later. So first, in terms of what we do, since we're online all the time, I just want to tell you a couple of things we have scheduled. Next Wednesday, we have Melissa Westendorf, who's a psychologist who's been interested in technology addiction for a long time, even before the pandemic, and especially around how technology affects young people and children. So she's leading a webinar next week on digital distress, about helping children and teens these days. Although I think a lot of people are distressed outside of just children. That's next Wednesday. On October 22nd, David Kessler is back for a 3-hour webinar on the topic we're going to be talking more and more today about finding meaning. And it will be great to have David on the screen for 3 hours for that session. And we are offering a special discount of 20% for those of you who decide to David in a few weeks for that session. The one other thing I'll tell you about is our first live program will be something we've never done before. There'll be 4 weeks of training in Cancun, Mexico, at a beautiful 5-star resort. We're going to have people like Bessel van der Kolk, Frank Anderson, Janina Fisher, and others leading programs and giving us the opportunity to be with them, to learn in the morning, and then to play and do many other things in Cancun this February. We'll send you a link if you're interested in that. Of course, you're more than welcome to join us. This is how we're going to work today. First, if you see on your screen Emily Porter, she is our hostess with the mostest. She's there for you and David and for me. And if you have any questions, issues, go to the chat line. When it comes to our Q&A time, if you have a question, you can either go to the chat line, write the question if you'd like Emily to ask it, or just say, I have a question to ask David. You also can use the hand-raising function on the bottom of your Zoom screen, and that's another way to ask questions. Everything we're doing now is we're providing live transcription. So if it's easier for you to also see closed captioning, go to the live transcription section of your Zoom screen in the bottom and press the proper buttons and you will see the closed captioning. Everything we do also is live, it's recorded. So we're going to send you a video of this hour. If there's something you want to see again, you are certainly welcome to do that. So tomorrow, we're going to send you a copy of this video. So now, that's kind of the housekeeping stuff. So I'm really happy to welcome you to this session with David Kessler. Many of you know David because he's an author, a public speaker, and he's a death and grieving expert. He's published 5 books, including 2 co-written with the psychiatrist Elisabeth Kubler-Ross, who really changed the landscape on understanding grief. His latest book is Finding Meaning, the 6th Stage of Grief, which will be the topic of the webinar on October 22nd. For most of his life, David has taught counselors, psychotherapists, physicians, nurses, police, and first responders about the end of life, trauma, and grief. He facilitates talks and workshops and retreats for those experiencing grief. And his latest book, Finding Meaning, David gives readers a roadmap to remembering those who have died with more love than pain. He shows us how to move forward in a way that honors our loved ones. And David's insight is both professional and intensely personal. We'll discuss that. Ultimately, I think what David is offering us is understanding the 6th stage, the potential of the 6th stage of grief, finding meaning that goes beyond the 5 stages that Kubler-Ross popularized, has made kind of part of the common dialogue. So David, first, thank you very much for joining us today.
So glad to be with you, Michael. It's been a long time coming, actually.
Yeah, we started talking a few years about come to Toronto and give a workshop. I guess our plans change. But David, I'm sure a lot of people know you through your work, through your website, grief.com. But just tell us a little bit about yourself for people who don't know you.
Well, I often say this isn't a profession that I chose. It chose me in a lot of ways. I grew up with a mother who was ill, and when I was about 13 years old, she had to go to a hospital in the big city, which was a few hours away. And while she was in the hospital dying, which I didn't understand at that time at my age, a shooting broke out at the hotel where we were. And it turned out to be one of the first mass shootings in the US. So at a very young age, I experienced a mass shooting, trauma, my mother dying, ICUs, and there was no one to help me. And in a lot of ways, I say I've tried to become the person who possibly could have helped me back then. And that's what this work has been about throughout the years, is helping people. And, I look at it that I do end-of-life care and hospice and palliative care, and also grief and loss. And I'm a big believer that, we have to look at dying and we have to look at grief. As you mentioned, my first book was on the needs of the dying, and I've written many books on grief. And, I'm sort of trying to change the world one person at a time, because we're such a grief illiterate society.
David, grief is something that we all experience, but even as professional helpers, it hasn't been discussed a lot. Certainly when I went to social work school, there wasn't a lot on grief, and your personal experiences led you on this journey. And I'm particularly interested in how you made your connection with Elisabeth Kubler-Ross, who has informed so many of us and brought the topic of grief to be part of a public conversation. How did you meet her, and what was it like working with her?
Sure. Well, you're so correct. It's interesting. I just finished a grief educator program, and there were so many therapists, counselors who said they had their master's degree, there were psychologists, and they had not one mandatory class on grief. That it's the population is going to, I often say the death rate is 100%. Here's something that every single family is going to go through, and we don't even have like one mandatory class in it. So as you mentioned, I was really honored to work with Elisabeth Kubler-Ross. Her and I got to know each other because I was working on my first book, The Needs of the Dying, and she was a keynote speaker at a conference in Egypt. And I was so excited to hear her and see her and go to this conference. And of course, as I mentioned, she was the keynote speaker and I was going to be wallpaper. And that's when she had her first stroke and was unable to go. And afterwards, I was talking to the organizer of the conference, who said, they were feeling awkward. They needed to call her about some business. They had their son's name. How do you do that? And she asked me if I would make the first call. So I called Elisabeth Kubler-Ross's son, Ken Ross, who's a very well-known photographer in his own right. I called him and asked how his mother is. And he said, here's her number, give her a call. And I called Elisabeth, and she, told me about having her stroke. She asked me how Egypt was. And then at the end of the call, she said to me, I said, Elisabeth, my goodness, it's such an honor to speak to you. I hope some way, somehow our paths can cross. And she said, how about Tuesday? And that was my first glimpse of this woman that was used to making things happen. I was going to be, maybe we'll see each other in the world. And she was like, Tuesday. So that was my first getting to meet Elisabeth on that Tuesday. And we became great friends. She helped me with the first book. She was just such a inspiration and just a mentor to me. And we ended up writing the book Life Lessons together. And throughout our years together, I would say to her, Elisabeth, your stages are getting really misinterpreted and distorted, and people are thinking they have to be linear. And she would go, no, I explained it all in my first book on death and dying. There was even more than 5 stages. And I don't think people realized how personally for her hard it was to have your life work reduced to 5 words: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. And I kept talking about people are really massacring these stages of yours. And so finally, she called me up one day and said, all right, let's write a book and clear this up. And we wrote this book on grief and grieving. And the shocking thing is, literally on page 1 of this book, on page 1, we say the stages are not linear. They're not a requirement. Everyone's grief is unique. You go through them many times. There's no one right model of grief, and there's no map of grief. And I thought it was extraordinary that literally everyone's issues with the stages we addressed on page 1. And so many people today who have issues, I'll go, did you read the book? And sometimes they'll go, oh, they just on death and dying, they were never adapted for grief. I'm like, no, 5 years of my life, they were adapted for grief. So I think that's such a myth, and I tried to clear that up in the new book also.
Yeah, I think there has been a lot of misunderstanding, because I've heard people say, it's not linear, as they've come to this. But I want to ask you a question, David. I hope this isn't voyeuristic, because you knew her around the time of her death and leading up to her death. What was that experience like for you, and what can you say about that to our audience?
I think one of the confusing things that happened is early on, in probably right after she had her stroke, a reporter went to visit Elisabeth in the hospital in 1995 after her stroke, and she was very angry. And Elisabeth had been open about, she said, if I ever get sick and die, I want a Mack truck to hit me. I want to be taken out of the game quickly. And she would often say, my worst fear is something slow like a stroke. So when she had her stroke, she was so angry. And there was a headline that came out because of that reporter that said, Kubler-Ross dying a bitter death. And Elisabeth and I wrote about that in Life Lessons. And she said to me, when I said, Elisabeth, what did you think about everyone saying how angry you were about the stroke? She said, oh, people love my stages. They just didn't want me to be in one. Because she was clearly in the stage of anger. And she didn't die. She went on to live almost a whole decade after that stroke. And, I think that got so much press that people don't realize what her real death was like. And I was so honored to be there with her family and a couple of friends and her grandkids. And I can tell you, she had a really peaceful, beautiful death. And, I wrote about it, that people wanted her to have an extraordinary death. And really what she had and what she taught is for us to have a personal, ordinary death out of the hospital at home. And that's what she had.
So, the 5 stages, whether they've been understood or misunderstood, have been part of the kind of vocabulary for the general public and for therapists for a long time. And then you developed the 6th stage and brought it to our attention as a way of understanding grief and grieving. So tell us about your development of your 6th stage.
I was always curious about Viktor Frankl's work. I obviously had read A Man's Search for Meaning. And it was interesting. I would hear people talk about meaning to parents who had had a child die. And they would say about meaning, and the parent, the bereaved parent would go, Viktor Frankl's, he lived, my child died. And it didn't seem to equate. And I knew that meaning and what Viktor Frankl had talked about was so powerful. I didn't know why it wasn't relating quite in the world of grief. And so I had studied that, and I had written, literally at this desk where I'm sitting, I'd written a couple of chapters about meaning and grief. And I thought, oh, this might be an article or something. Then, horrifically, unfortunately, my younger son, David, I got a call that he had died at 21 years old. And when he died, it's as brutal as anyone could imagine. And it was just so horrific. And I wanted to write a note to every bereaved parent I had ever counseled, saying I had no idea how intense the pain was and how bad it was. I canceled everything. I canceled all my talks. I canceled lectures. And I was just home grieving, and I had to do what I had taught everyone else to do. And I went to grief counseling. I went to grief groups, and I literally sat in grief groups with a cap on, glasses. I didn't have my contacts in. And I sat in a group where literally my book was on a table 5 feet away. My books were there. And I couldn't tell anyone, that's me. I knew I had to be not the grief expert, but the father who had to bury his child. And so in that pain, I was just sitting at this desk one day, and I was going through things. It was probably maybe about 2 months in, and I ran across those papers on meaning. And I remember picking them up and going, yeah, like this is going to help with the pain. And I threw them down. And then about a week later, I picked them up again and began reading about meaning. It didn't take away the pain, but it gave it a cushion. So that's when I began talking to other parents, to people who had lost a spouse, whose their spouse had died, to people who a parent had died, a sibling had died, and began to be so curious about meaning. And that became the new book, Finding Meaning, the 6th Stage of Grief. People started saying, oh, that's the 6th stage. And I was like, oh, I don't know. And I talked to the Kubler-Ross family and foundation, and I was so honored. They gave me permission to add a 6th stage to her iconic stages. It was another chance to go back and clear up the myths about the stages. And it was such a powerful experience. And as I finished the book right here, I cried, and I thought, I hope this heals others as much as it has healed me. And I think the biggest thing I want people to know that's confusing about meaning is when they hear meaning, there's no meaning in my loved one's death. And I'll go, you're right. There's no meaning in their death. There's no meaning in a horrific murder, a child's death, a spouse's death. Meaning is in us. It's what we do after our loved one dies. So that's how the book came about.
Yeah. And even as you're talking, people are writing in the chat line how you've been so inspirational. And now that you're talking about the value of finding meaning, I wonder what you've learned through many people you taught, the kinds of meanings they found in different kinds of losses. If you could share some examples from other people's lives who started to see, what, in the field we call post-traumatic growth, but it really is about meaning in lives. So what can you share with us?
Well, the interesting thing is, of course, there's people, like someone wrote in the chat, there's people that it's inspired them to become counselors, professionals, there's so many doctors out there, there's so many sports people that naturally, I mean, I certainly haven't in any way discovered meaning. You can look at sports figures and celebrities and doctors and nurses and social workers and psychologists who had this experience maybe in their childhood that naturally made meaning of it. I wanted to help people have a little bit of a blueprint to make that meaning. And so I think one of the things is we always talk about the counselors, the doctors, the lawyer, whoever made the meaning. And we talk about the big meanings. But I also remind people that there's small, meaningful moments. That meaning isn't found just in the person who starts the foundation or the 5K walk. It's also in this moment that you and I are having, that all of us are having. Someone might hear something today that might touch them, that they might then give to a client later. And that makes this moment, Michael, that you and I are having right now so meaningful to me. So it's about beginning to recognize those meaningful moments. And I'll tell you, there was one woman that I was working with who was telling me about her son, Aaron, who died, I think, at 2 years old. And she told me about her memories of him. And she said, there's no meaning in a child's death. There's no meaning to be found. There's no possibility of this. And I have found that people who don't recognize the meaning do have a harder time grieving. And I remember saying to her, I understand you can't see the meaning yet, but I want you to know, me sitting here, learning about Aaron, hearing about his life is meaningful to me. And us just naming meaningful moments opens up a world to people seeing that meaning is all about us, even in the darkest moments. And I think that's so powerful to understand that even in our darkest moments, there is a little light there.
Therapists see people grieving many losses. Of course, the big ones, death, serious illness, but it could be loss of job, betrayal in a relationship, many loss of a pet, things that change people's lives. And in this therapeutic process, I have a question about therapist self-disclosure, because David, I think one of the reasons people are attracted to you are your honesty, your transparency, you're a real person. And when there have been surveys and research done from clients of therapists, and the first thing they often say is, what's most important to me is the honesty and the realness of my therapist. Do you have any advice about self-disclosure in therapy? Any guidelines to help therapists who are seeing people coming into them, and how, when and if they can self-disclose?
Well, I'll tell you, it's interesting how that's changed over the years, Michael, because when I started doing this work, and at a certain point, I began talking about my mother's death and the tragedy and the shooting. And I got a lot of pushback from colleagues going, no, 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 do not do that. Do not go down that road. That's dangerous. And they really, I stayed the course on that. And people, like a lot of colleagues, had judgment on me. And it's interesting how that's changed. And literally the other day, I saw a YouTube video on the colleague who judged me the most. And sure enough, now 20 years later, they are self-disclosing about a death. So it's interesting to see how it's changed. When we self-disclose, I talk about two things. We want to make sure we have done our own work around it. You don't want to self-disclose and put your own grief and loss front and center and take away from the clients where they're at. And two, you want to make sure it's in service of the client. So it's really important when we talk about this that we don't get lost in that. We know when and where to do it. And I think It's so powerful when you use it correctly. I think the temptation that all of us can easily do is self-disclose before we're ready. And that's where it really is about making sure we've done our own grief work.
Okay, I'll have one more question, and then I'll open it up. You have many fans who've seen you here and others, and we invite everyone to ask questions by noting in the chat line like to ask a question. If you'd like to write it out, Emily will read it, or you're welcome to use the raised hand function. So the last question I'll ask is about complicated grief. There's more and more talk about complicated grief and how you deal with that in therapy. Can you help define for us what's the difference between regular grief and complicated grief?
Well, I guess it depends on who you ask. But since you're asking me today,
I'm asking you, yeah.
Right, I would say, boy, what a complicated topic complicated grief is. So, there's different ways to look at complicated grief. There's complicated grief that is used here in the US. I don't know how it's actually used in Canada. Perhaps you or someone can inform me. But it's used here as a payment mechanism. It's how clinicians get paid. People need to have that idea that there is a diagnosis in order to get paid. So there's that piece of it. It's important we don't confuse a payment method that's around a diagnosis with maybe what's the reality. There's two ways to look at this. One of the ways to look at this is that people who are in grief sometimes do not get the support they need. They don't get the support they need. So sometimes they feel like, is this complicated? And they don't know that we've kind of become a society that thinks if we label it as complicated, your support becomes more valid, your diagnosis, your grief becomes more valid. So sometimes people in grief want the diagnosis so that they can feel valid in their grief. The second thing that I think also happens is there's many institutes in different places, and in those different places, what they have is they have definitions of complicated grief. One place that I've kind of challenged publicly, that their definition of complicated grief is any ongoing feeling, prolonged feeling of sadness or anger that you have after 6 months. And I challenge them as a grief specialist and as a bereaved father going, wait a minute, if I still have sad days, 6 months and 1 week, I have this diagnosis of complicated grief. So I'm not a fan of how we've turned grief into a problem to be solved. Complicated grief, when it does occur, and I think it's so different. I mean, I could have a parent die and my grief is complicated, my siblings isn't. It needs attention, it needs to be talked about, it needs to be witnessed, it needs to be discussed. I would love that we quit discussing the diagnosis and talk more about the solutions and how let's give grief the attention it deserves. And then it's fascinating how magically the complicated grief dissolves. So
Well, thank you very, very much for that answer. That's really helpful. Okay, Emily, do you have some questions? You want to start us off, please?
Sure. Angie, do you want to unmute?
Yes, thank you. So I'm really enjoying this talk. I'm coming as a registered social worker from Toronto, Canada, and much of my role is around supporting folks who have experienced the loss of their animal companions. And one of the things that I'll often do, especially in support group settings, for example, is to ask a question that my therapist asked me many years ago, which is, what has your pet or your animal taught you? And I find that that question really starts to spark this idea of meaning making. And I was just wondering if you had any other, sorry, I'm just out of breath because I was running up the stairs, but if you have any suggestions for things that we can start to ask that will probe people to start really getting this meaning mindset, recognizing that sometimes we're only seeing people once and don't have ongoing relationships with them.
Yeah, I think sometimes it's about planting the seed that meaning is possible. I might say to someone, I know you can't see it now. I understand it may be a long ways off, but at some point, you may be able to see some meaning in what this pet, your loved one, has left behind. I often talk about, when I get asked about pet loss, I often say, if the love is real, the grief is real. I mean, that's the bottom line. If the love is real, the grief is real. And I think that can be challenging for some people. One thing that goes along with your question and something Michael mentioned about how we have so many griefs these days, different ones. I think about there's micro grief and macro grief. In other words, there's big grief and small grief. And we live in this world where we don't realize this one word grief covers so many different losses. And I'll give you just a idea of how this works post-pandemic. And I tell people when they say, oh, I'm still in the post-pandemic stress. I'm like, when did it become post? I feel like we're still in it. So when I think about this concept, I think about one day I was out walking with a friend on my street during the height, maybe in April, when we were just beginning to walk out of our houses for the first time. And we were taking a walk, and a woman on my street came up to me in tears and said, don't you do something in grief? And I said, yes. And I talked to her about it. And she goes, I've just postponed my wedding. And, she cried about her wedding being postponed. And after she walked away, I had chatted with her and gave her some reassurances and really witnessed her grief is what I did. My friend said to me, I can't believe she was going on and on about a postponed wedding when your child has died. And I said to my friend, you don't understand how grief works. Grief isn't a pie. There's a limited amount of it. And she just took some of my pie. The world is big enough for all our losses. The world is big enough for our human losses, our pet losses, our pandemic losses, our job losses. It's big enough for all those losses. And when we try to compare losses, I often say the problem is when you win, you lose. And to let go of those old thoughts about the worst loss. I always say, when people ask me which is the worst loss, I always say yours. Your loss is the worst loss. That woman who came up to me, she's never had a child die. She's never had a spouse die. Her worst loss is a wedding that she's been dreaming about since she was 5 years old. Can I not witness and honor her loss and be secure in my grief? Her loss doesn't take away from the loss of my son dying. So when someone tells me a pet has died, oh my goodness, I honor their loss. It's not taking away from anything. Let's all live in a world where all these losses exist together. So thank you for that question. That's a good one. All right.
Thank you. I see David's hands up, and then we have a question from Leah. Hi, Robert.
Hi. I've had lots of losses in my life. I'm 65. It's impossible not to have. But when I reflect upon that, next to my parents, the loss of my pets through my lifetime have been very significant and as significant in some respects. And it strikes me that part of the reason is that all of those losses are beings or animals that demonstrated unconditional love. And I think I'm separated for the second time. That's a loss, but it's a very different loss because that was a very intimate relationship, but there really wasn't unconditional love. I think in those relationships, they become very complicated. And it feels funny to say it, but it really is. I mean, my pets were rescues and the love was always unconditional. My parents got angry at me sometimes, but the love was always unconditional.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I think there's some other aspects to that too that gets underestimated in that. You know, our world is changing, and our world, most of us grew up with blood is thicker than water. And oh my gosh, there's so much more estrangement in the world. There's chosen families in the world. There's pets in the world. And what we find is, you know, as you mentioned, the unconditional love, the proximity. You know, these days people have a brother who's across the country that they never got along with. They only seen in the past 30 years at a couple of funerals and had nasty words with one another. And that's their experience of their brother. And they have this pet that they see every single day for 16 years. And in our old model, we go, the brother you never talk to is more important than that pet that loved you every single day and was in your intimate space. So I think we're beginning to realize that sometimes proximity, familiarity, unconditional love, all those are factors.
Thank you. Leah has a question. Leah, are you there?
I'm here. Sorry, I can't get the camera to work.
That's okay.
So I'm a registered social worker in Canada as well. I work in home care. And one of the things I see a lot of are individuals who've been diagnosed with MS and things that are degenerative. And they're struggling with.
I'm sorry, she's going out and I can't really hear the question. Are you able to, Emily?
Her question was about good resources for individuals who are grieving loss of functioning due to disease progression.
You know, here's one of the things that I think is so helpful. We have this myth that people think there's different tools for different grief. The tools are exactly the same. The tools are, I use the same tools when there's a death. I use the tools when there's a job loss. I use the tools when there's a loss of a limb. I mean, the tools are the same. I think we have an idea that the tools are different. The losses, of course, are different. A divorce is different. The person still roams the earth. They're still maybe rejecting you every day. You know, a limb, there's phantom pain, a degenerative disease, there's changes you see every day. But still, at the end of the day, the tools we want to use are the same tools. So I would encourage people to apply the tools to every type of loss because they do work for every type of loss, and to let go of the thought that, oh, I need a specialized tool. Grief needs to be witnessed. Grief needs to be validated. Grief needs to be seen. We weren't meant to be islands of grief. We need to talk about our loved one who died, our pet who died, our limb that's been removed, our body that may feel like it's decaying to us, the loss of an eyesight, whatever it may be. We need to see those losses and validate them.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Such a good question.
And Caroline had a question. Caroline, do you want to unmute? Oh, hi, Caroline.
Did I do that?
Yeah,
Can you hear me?
there you go.
Okay. I had a question about when grief is compounded by feelings of guilt related to the death. So, for example, when you feel responsible for a pet's accidental death or your child's accidental death.
So It's complicated to discuss this, but I'll give you the 2-minute version of it if I can.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Sure. You know, there's different types. I would say 99% of the things I have found people feel guilty of aren't what caused the death. People say all the time, if I hadn't gone to lunch, if I had gotten home 5 minutes early, if I had done this, if I had done that. And I use real tools, and in the book I talked about them, and in our workshop I'll talk about these tools that really help us understand lunch doesn't cause death. Getting home 5 minutes late doesn't cause death. I go to lunch every day and no one dies. But our mind, for a lot of different reasons, would rather feel guilty than helpless. So there's that aspect. There's the 99% of people that feel guilty for a reason that actually didn't cause their loved one's death. Many times it was just an accident. It was mental illness. It was addiction. It was just horrific things that happen in the universe. And that tiny accident had devastating consequences of our loved one dying. So there's that. Now the 1% is maybe the unintentional neglect or the intentional neglect. Someone answers a phone, the toddler walks out in 1 second, and something horrific happens. That was unintentional, and there's intentional. People sometimes would like people to die, and they shoot them and other things like that. So with the unintentional ones, and even with the intentional ones, many times those are done more in prison and things we do them, is to look at forgiveness, We have to forgive ourselves and do forgiveness work. And we're often told about forgiveness, but we don't actually get real concrete ways of how forgiveness works. So it's important to really dive into all those aspects. Thanks for that question.
Thank you.
I was just going to ask if that's something he's going to cover in his upcoming workshop.
I'll be able to cover some of that, yes.
Before Bonnie's question, we have had a couple of questions about if you can talk a little bit about, you've mentioned tools, and if you can define the tools that you're referring to.
Oh my goodness, there's hundreds of them. There's hundreds of them. And I would say a lot of you know many of the tools, depending on your education. Some you may not. But, you know, it is things like witnessing grief, knowing how to test guilt, knowing what confabulation is. I mean, there's a lot of things that we talk about. You know, we'll do a lot in the workshop we'll talk about. You know, I'll have more time there than to cover. But I think it's about knowing those tools. And my guess is some of you will find out that, you know, I'll be validating tools you use, but I hope also introducing some new ones.
Thank you. Bonnie, do you want to unmute?
If you could.
Sure. I was just wondering, so I'm in palliative care. I'm the executive director of an organization, and of course we provide bereavement. Most of the time is peer-to-peer. However, if it's complicated, well, deeper than that, it's psychosocial. However, I do find that I too have had a long history of grief and bereavement, and sometimes I will also talk about myself and self-disclose. And I've also had raised eyebrows bringing up my own story. Normally I can segue and get people off and onto their own, but the odd time, David, somebody does start then saying, well, when you lost him, what did your blah, 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 all the questions come, and then you have to deflect and get it off of you. But, you know, sometimes it's hard. And I've even had people afterwards contact me after they've even gone home and said, well, I was thinking about you. That's dicey for me. And I would like to know what you do in that case.
Sure. It is what you say. I don't call it deflection. I call it putting the attention back on them. And I will say, some people in here are in the program now. I see they've said hi. I just finished the first portion of our grief educator program. We have a year-long grief educator program, and we have 3 categories. We have peers, people who want to be peer counselors. We have coaches, and we have for licensed professionals, therapists, counselors. And in peer-to-peer counseling, your story becomes even more important because besides the tools you learn, your experience is so important in the peer-to-peer work. And when we talk about that, of course, people do get attached to your story. So when people say to me, oh my goodness, how did you deal with it? I usually, and this is an important thing for, I think, all of us, that when someone says to me, how did you get through your grief? If that's a moment I go, oh my God, I'm still working on it, I shouldn't have self-disclosed. If them saying, how did you get through it, throws me, it's too early for me to be self-disclosing. I usually have 2 or 3 answers. How did I do it? I went to a grief counselor, and I'm glad you're here doing it. I went to a group. I'm glad you're in our group today. I took it one day at a time. I have 3 or 4 answers that I'm ready to give for that. How did you do it? Anything beyond, if they want to know details of a death or details of my life, I will say, listen, the details of my life or my loved one's deaths or how my mother died or my son died aren't as important as the details of your loved one's death. So I really want us to focus on that. And then I'll go, what is it when you ask me, you want to know what that shooting did to me as a child? There's something in your question. I'm so curious as to why that's the question that's so meaningful to you. And I'll keep bringing it back to what are they looking for in their question? I hope that helps. Thank you. Great question. Wow, you all got such good questions today.
Carol Ann, let's get you unmuted.
Yes, David, this is great listening to you. And I'm going to talk from my personal experience of death. I watched my husband slowly die for 6 years. And I'm questioning, did I grieve each time or each period? Or like I'm still questioning. This is 4 years later now. Did I grieve? Because when death finally came, I was so grateful because of watching the loss of this big, strong man, both his body, his mind, and who he was as a man. So grief has been difficult, and yet sometimes I feel that I've stepped back. I haven't dealt with it. So my question, as a therapist, I'm getting a lot of older people who talk about lifelong death or lifelong grief, because sometimes it is. And
Right.
I think I just brought up 2 questions, so I'll stick with the me one.
Okay. So I have a few things to say about that. One, first of all, when it's an ongoing loss like that, we don't realize how much we grieve during the chronic illness, how much we grieve all along the way. So I think we do a lot of grieving along the way that we don't often give ourselves credit for. The second thing is, grief is an organic process. And the way to complicate our grief, challenge our grief, is by questioning it without action or judging it. If you want to slow down your grief, start examining it or judging it. let it be an organic process in you. I have an online support group that I do 4 times a week for people called Tender Hearts, and it's an ongoing group. And there's people in it who are newly grieving, acutely grieving, and there's a lot of people there, like yourself, that just want to have a place to go on, and maybe they're professionals like you in mental health who just want to check in and see if they've done all their grief work. So that's a good way to sort of take action or go to a grief counselor. Here's the thing, our grief needs dedicated time. When people said to me, why did you go to a grief counselor? I mean, what could they have said to you? I say, well, first of all, there's a million things I don't know. Number 2, when we're in grief ourselves, our tools aren't often quite as obvious to us. And we need another person to witness us. So whether it's you going to a counselor and talking about that grief, or Tender Hearts, or whatever mechanism, maybe it's a local grief group, I would encourage you to take action and check that out. The other thing you're bringing up is a lot of times after a long illness, a chronic illness, people will have a sense of relief. And it's very normal. And to know you are relieved because the suffering has ended, not because your loved one died. And that's such an important distinction. So thank you for that question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sampara, let's get you unmuted. There we go.
Hi, I don't know if there's a question in here, but I wanted to share something based on my my existence as a human being and in my professional role as a therapist, is that I have found, and I'm going through a tremendous amount of grief right now, but I have found that the sooner I can use the tools available to me to come to a space of acceptance, and in helping my clients come to that space of acceptance, is that the smoother it is to get through this process. And I'm also a yoga teacher and a laughter therapist. And I find that a lot of times grief is kind of stuck in the body, in the soma. So it's very helpful to experience that in the physical body. And then when, in some cases, when the timing is right, a little bit of humor and laughter helps diffuse the situation as well. And allowing people, including myself, the permission to grieve. That sometimes, you know, we think, oh, we're just so strong, we can do this. And I've just personally gone through this because I just got back from the Cleveland Clinic in Ohio, where my husband had a very complicated open heart surgery. And we were away for 3 weeks, and it's
the packages at the wrong house.
Okay. And losing a parent to Parkinson's. So, you know, I just wanted to share that. And if you had any,
Well, thank you.
comments on that.
Sure, of course. So a couple of things you mentioned. You know, I do a lot of posting on social media. You can find me, whether it's Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, as I am David Kessler. And I do a lot of posting about acceptance. And acceptance is so important. But whenever I post about acceptance, I always put in the line, easier said than done. Because acceptance is such a powerful tool, but it's not an easy tool. So that's the first piece. The second piece I want to mention about you talking about grief in the body is so important. At my physical retreats, when I would do physical retreats back in the pre-pandemic days, I would always do them with Paul Denniston. Paul Denniston teaches grief yoga, and he's worked with Bessel van der Kolk and Peter Levine and all those folks. And you know, he talks about how the body remembers grief, how the body remembers grief. And he actually has a new book coming out about that called Healing Through Yoga. that will be very powerful. And I think we haven't recognized, whenever I do those retreats, I know I'm doing the mind, the heart part, but you need to address the body part. And just like you mentioned, he also talks about laughter and does laughter yoga. So anyone who wants information on him, you can find that at griefyoga.com. It's pretty powerful stuff.
Thank you, David.
Great questions.
The next question is asking, can you speak to how to work with a client who doesn't want to reduce their guilt or forgive themselves?
Sure. I hate to do this quote, but I'm going to. I had the privilege of doing a show recently with William Shatner, Captain Kirk. And he's become a sweet friend. He's 90 years old. And one of the things I have to say about Star Trek is one of their prime directives, one of their rules was if they went to a planet and the wheel had not been discovered, they could not introduce the wheel. And I think about that we have to meet people where they are, not where we would like them to be. I mean, I'm a fixer at heart. I would love to fix you. I've got 3 solutions for any problem you've got. But I have to remember, when you're in grief, you are not broken and you do not need to be fixed. And I have to respect your journey and not introduce the wheel 1 second before you're ready to learn about the wheel. So it's important that sometimes we want people to be further along than they are because it's hard for us to see them in pain. But I got to give them the dignity of working through their pain in their own pace, in their own way. And I believe the goal of grief work is to eventually remember with more love than pain, but it has to be at the client's pace.
Thank you for that. Unfortunately, I think we're running out of time. So Michael, I think it's your turn to take it away.
First, I want to apologize to people who have questions because there's so many of them, but we do want to respect David, Simon, all our time. And also we've had a few questions in the chat line about further kind of training that or things and programs that David offers. We will send out that information on his website. And on October 22nd, all our webinars are live and then recorded, and you can have access to them for a year. So if you'd like to join David either live or get a copy of that webinar video, it's going to be a 3-hour session where David will really have 3 hours to talk more about the 6th stage of grief, all of his teachings and learning about the techniques and tools and how we can help people. That's in a few weeks' time, and you're certainly invited to learn more about that. We'll send out that information with a special discount for you today. But, more importantly, I want to thank you, David, so much.
Oh, you're welcome, Michael, and I'm so glad to be with you, and I can't wait to do the workshop with folks, because I hate giving like the small, quick answers, because I know people feel like, wait, you didn't address that enough. So, and I can, people are like, wait, but that doesn't pertain to this, and we can get more into that in the workshop. And I'm also, one of the things we didn't get to that's a big deal for me is self-care. So I'm going to send everyone here a quick video on self-care, because that's so important.
That's fantastic. David, we have a little tradition we started at the beginning, because people are often very thankful for our speakers and the chance to be together like this. So we're going to open up all the microphones. And after I say thank you, David, we'll let everyone else say their thank yous and goodbyes. We have several hundred people. It'll be a cacophony, but that's how we end. So thank you, everybody.